The
Okay, very good. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Betty, for the introductions. I'm going to kind of hit the ground running because a lot to cover, and also want to allow good time for Q&A. I will say I'm at the IU Indianapolis O'Neill School. I'm also a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at IU Bloomington. And so what I'm going to do is, first of all, this is basically what I'll be talking about. Um, First of all, I'm going to give a kind of a very brief overview of U.S. Foreign policy and Middle East geopolitics. And for those of you who actually read the Great Decisions book every year, the actual focus and title of the topic on the Middle East for tonight is based on Mark Lynch's article, which is a very good article, and it's the United States and the Middle East. So it really is focusing on the U.S. Relationship with the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy over several administrations. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. I'm going to go through some very brief things on that. And then I'm going to look briefly at Iran and the role of Iran and its proxies in the region as a major kind of a foil in many ways to the U.S. and other and its allies. I will give a brief historical overview of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just hit on a few things that I think are important to provide some of the context for what's going on now. And then I will discuss a little bit the October 7th terrorist attack and the subsequent war in Gaza that is going on to this day. And then I'll just wrap up with just a few points on U.S. policy in relation to the Israel-Hamas war. And then we'll have some Q&A. And that's it. So let's get going here. First of all, just some on the U.S. policy and Middle East geopolitics. When we talk about the Middle East, the conventional understanding of what is the Middle East is inside that red circle that I have there. Turkey in the north, Iran to the east, the Arabian Peninsula to the south, and Egypt to the west. And everything in between is what we would consider the modern Middle East. And of course, North Africa stretches across the rest of Africa, and that's also part of the Arab world. But generally, we're talking about the Middle East or Middle East and North Africa. The other map I have is obviously Israel and the Palestinian territories, and I've circled in red the Gaza Strip to give you a sense of there, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that map. When you look at the boundaries of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, as I will show in a few minutes, those borders were actually drawn by the British in the 1920s and codified into international law with the British Mandate for Palestine. So the boundaries of what we consider today Israel or Palestine or Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, those boundaries did not exist before the 1920s. Instead, they were part of a broader part of the Ottoman Empire. And I'll discuss that in a few minutes. When we look at U.S. policy in the Middle East, I think we can make the case that there are several primary national interests that the U.S. pursues in the region. Not in necessarily any particular order, but I think these are kind of these are important orders here. Oil and political and economic stability. A major focus of American foreign policy since the end of World War II has been maintaining the free flow of oil and access to oil and the price stability of oil because the global economy runs on fossil fuels. The relationship between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia since 1945 has been forged on this basic alliance of maintaining stable oil prices and stable access to oil. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Shia was overthrown and the Islamic Republic came into power, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is extremely anti-American, from that point forward, the United States, for the first time, took direct military role in the Persian Gulf, and sending it with the Fifth Fleet was established based in Bahrain. The U.S. has military deployments, and we've been on the ground militarily in various parts of the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution. Another thing in terms of this general first category of interest in the Middle East is not just maintaining the free flow of oil, but also maintaining the free flow of global trade through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And as I will show in a few minutes, that has become under threat since October 7th with the Houthi rebels in Yemen attacking merchant shipping in the Red Sea, with the U.S. Navy responding. A second major interest of the United States in the Middle East is supporting friendly Arab regimes and deterring adversaries in the region. During the Cold War, it was obviously to deter the Soviet Union, and that was a major, and a lot of the alliances we had in the Middle East were to deter the Soviets. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, it's been to deter Iran. And also from the late 70s through about 1990, it was also to deter Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So support friendly Arab regimes, deter adversaries. Another major foreign policy interest and goal in the Middle East for the U.S. is support for Israel and also support for Arab-Israeli peace. American military support for Israel really begins after the 1967 Six-Day War. Up to that point, the primary supplier of military equipment to Israel was France. And in fact, France fought the Six-Day War Israel fought the Six-Day War with French aircraft and French and British tanks for the most part. Since the Six-Day War, really beginning with the Rogers Peace Plan in 1968, the United States has been making consistent efforts to try and achieve Arab-Israeli peace between Israel and Arab states, and then also between Israel and the Palestinians. Beginning with the Oslo Accords in 1993, which were supervised to a certain extent by President Bill Clinton. Since then, every single American administration, to varying degrees, with the exception of the Trump administration, has supported a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to varying degrees has used its resources to try and move Israel and the Palestinians towards some type of a peaceful settlement. In addition to this, after 9/11 in the Bush administration, as part of the global war on terror, a major foreign policy goal was regime change in Iraq, which didn't go too well, but that was another thing that happened. And then beyond just the Bush administration, a major focus of U.S. policy in the Middle East has been counterterrorism. After 9/11, it was against Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates in the Middle East. And from 2014 forward, it's also been against ISIS or the Islamic State and other Islamic State and other radical jihadist groups in the Middle East. So these are all some of the different areas that the U.S. has been interested in, and it has sort of been driving American foreign policy for many years. When we're looking at the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and you can see in the first picture here of the map with Africa, the Red Sea is the entranceway or the exit from the Suez Canal, and maintaining the free flow of goods through the Red Sea is a major function of the U.S. Navy in the region, and it is important to global trade. As you can see on this first map, the shortest trade route to get from London to Mumbai, India, is to go through the Suez Canal and down the Red Sea. If you do that, it's about 7,200 miles. If the Red Sea is closed off because of conflict, or if the Suez Canal is shut down, which has happened sometimes in previous wars, in order to get goods from, say, India to Europe, you have to go around the Cape of Good Hope down to the bottom of Africa and all the way around. And instead of 7,200 miles, it's 12,300 miles. So it's more days, more fuel, more costs, impacts on the global economy. So clearly, maintaining an open Red Sea, maintaining access to the Suez Canal is an essential economic as well as strategic interest of the United States and of a lot of other countries as well. If you look at the middle picture I have, the middle image, this is a map of the Red Sea at the base of it, with the Gulf of Aden, with Yemen on one side and Djibouti on the other. And what's interesting here is how many different countries have military bases of some form in Djibouti or in the area of the Red Sea. So it's not just the United States, and you can see a lot of different countries from European countries, Middle Eastern countries, China as well, all have some type of a military base or military presence in the Red Sea. And then the third map I have here is basically the area of control of the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And as you can see, they're right on the edge of the Red Sea. And this is where they have been getting involved and launching missiles and other strikes into shipping in the Red Sea, and some of them actually also aimed at Israel. And the Houthi rebels are heavily supported and armed by Iran, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Islamic Republic of Iran, particularly from a kind of a U.S. foreign policy perspective. Why do we care about Iran? And how is it impacting the region? Iran is the primary Shiite regime, and I don't want to oversimplify or overstress the differences between Sunni and Shia theology, for example. Frankly, I think the rivalry between Iran as the largest and most powerful Shia majority state and its major rival Saudi Arabia as sort of the cradle of Sunni Islam, it's not so much theological as it is geopolitical. It's much more about politics and geography and strategy and rivals for power. However, these religious differences also feed into a lot of the suspicion and animosity on both sides. But anyway, as you can see in this map, the dark green are countries with either Shiite majorities or very large Shiite minorities. Iran has been, since the revolution, has been supporting militias, rebels, insurgents, terrorist groups, others in all of the countries that have significant Shia presence. Okay, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen in particular. And in the post-Arab Spring civil wars that have taken place, particularly the ones in Syria and Yemen, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran have been on opposite sides, supporting different factions in those civil wars. And the Abraham Accords, in which the normalization of relationship between Israel and several Arab states, particularly the ones in the Gulf, have actually been aimed at sort of countering Iran. And as probably most of you know, prior to October 7th, prior to the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel, Israel and the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia were working very closely and were moving in the direction of reaching some type of an agreement, of a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and a U.S. Defense pact with Saudi Arabia as part of the deal. And all of this was aimed largely with concern to a mutual common adversary, which is Iran. Iran is a major sponsor of Hamas, and the timing of the October 7th attack was no pure coincidence, because neither Hamas nor Iran wanted to see a positive relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which truly would have been groundbreaking. When we look at Iran and we look at Iran's role in the region, its major force is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which I'm sure you've seen a lot in the news lately. And it is a state actor. Iran is a state actor supporting terrorism. And the Revolutionary Guard Corps is the way they do that. And they actually have a fighting force called the Quds Force. Quds referring to Jerusalem. The Quds Force, which is the fighters, the elite fighters of the Revolutionary Guards. It was created by the Iranian regime during and after the revolution. It has funded, trained, and armed Hezbollah in Lebanon since Hezbollah's creation. It helped form and it does arm to this day Shia militias in Iraq and in Syria. Those militias that have been fighting the United States, Shia militias that fought the United States in the Iraq War, and Shia and Syrian militias that have been firing weapons at the United States since October 7th. It supplies weapons to the Houthis in Yemen during the Yemen civil war, and also Houthi rockets and drones have been aimed at American naval vessels in the Red Sea and shipping, commercial shipping in the Red Sea as well. And all of this is being done, if not by the direction of Iran, at least with the complicity of Iran, and Iran certainly supports the Houthis. The relationship, whether or not the Houthis are taking direct Iran, that's up for grabs. We're not sure of that. It could also be that the Houthis are doing things on their own, but the primary sponsor, the primary state sponsor of the Houthi rebels is Iran. Iran also, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran also supports Hamas, and even more so the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both operative in Gaza. Since the Syrian civil war broke out, and when it looked like Bashar al-Assad and his regime was going to fall about 6 months into the civil war, Iran stepped in and played a major role in bolstering Assad and helping Assad to basically win the civil war. I mean, he's in control at this point. And both the Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah, which we'll talk about in a minute, have been on the ground fighting in Syria, supporting the Assad regime, and they've been responsible for many of the deaths that have been killed, many of the people that have been killed in Syria. The death toll right now in the Syrian civil war is well over 500,000 dead, and the majority of them have been killed by the regime. Also, the Revolutionary Guard Corps within Iran itself, in the last couple of years, has been using violence and intimidation against pro-democracy protesters in Iran, including women. And if you're familiar with last year or so, there was a woman died after being beaten to death by the morality police in Iran for not wearing her hijab properly. And there have been a lot of pro-democracy protests against the regime. And a lot of the crackdown, including some of the violent crackdown, has actually been done by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So not only do they use violence in neighboring countries, they're willing to use violence against their own people. Hezbollah is a major actor in the region, and it is Iran's chief proxy in the Middle East. Hezbollah is Arabic for Party of God. It was founded with the help of Iranian Revolutionary Guards, organizing militant Shiites in Lebanon. It was founded approximately 1983. They were on the ground beforehand, but once Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and started basically having fights with Shiites in the southern border, it was an opportunity for Hezbollah to be formed to fight against the Israelis, but also to fight for Iran's broader agenda. The United States first encounter with Hezbollah was in 1983, October of 1983. We just commemorated the anniversary a few months ago. And that was the truck bombings of the U.S. Marine barracks and the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. And these were American Marines operating as peacekeepers. They were not combatants in that sense. They were peacekeepers. 241 Marines, 58 French troops were killed in that bombing. And then the U.S. Embassy was also attacked with 63 killed there. That top picture is a very famous photograph of the Marine barracks after the bombing. That was actually taken by Bill Foley, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, a friend of mine, and we were both colleagues at Marian University, and he used to be at Marian for a while teaching photography there. But he took that picture that was on the front page of the New York Times, and a very famous photo. Some of you may remember that from 1983. Hezbollah was the only faction after the 15-year civil war in Lebanon that was allowed not to disarm, with the excuse being that it needed its weapons to continue fighting Israel. Of course, we had the second, what was known as the Second Lebanon War, which was a brief war of a few weeks, but a very, very deadly war that was sort of fought to a stalemate between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. As I said, Hezbollah joined the civil war in Syria in support of the Assad regime, and it's been fighting Sunni rebels, Sunni forces that the United States supports. It's been fighting against them, but it also fights against ISIS because ISIS is a Sunni jihadist organization that has very, very extreme hostility towards Shiites. So in that sense, ironically, Iran and Hezbollah and the United States are all, in a sense, on the same side against the Islamic State. At the same time, in other areas, we're obviously adversaries. Hezbollah is many things. It's a well-armed militia group, and it's an army that has military discipline, largely funded and influenced by Iran. It's a terrorist organization with international reach and operations, including in Latin America, and it has extensive fundraising around the world, also, again, sponsored by Iran. It's also a political party in Lebanon with representation in the Lebanese parliament. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, they say that Hezbollah is the world's most heavily armed non-state actor. It is believed by most sources that Hezbollah has approximately 150,000 rockets and missiles in its possession, all of which could be used in a war against Israel. Frankly, any place in Israel could be hit by Hezbollah rockets and missiles, and those missiles and rockets have been provided by Iran. When we're looking at what's been happening since October 7th, in terms of the regional repercussion, Iran and its proxies, you can see here the middle image with the red dots. This is already dated. This is from January, so the numbers are even higher now. But these are attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. And by the way, the U.S. has forces small numbers of forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, specifically to be dealing with ISIS. And so Syrian and Iraqi Shiite militias sponsored by Iran have actually been firing rockets and drone strikes against American forces and the bases. We've all heard about this. And then Yemen as well, the Houthis have done that as well in the Red Sea, as you can see. There's been nearly about almost 200 attacks now against the U.S. forces in one form or another, whether it was against the Navy or against ground forces. And recently, 3 American soldiers were killed on a Jordanian base near the Syrian border. And sovereign Jordanian territory was actually hit by a militia group supported by Iran. And that was a first, killing some American soldiers there. Last year, I was on a webinar with listening to Shireen Ebadi, among others. And this was about the peaceful pro-democracy movement in Iran. Shireen Ebadi is an Iranian author who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. And she was talking about the future of Iran. And I found this quote very powerful, so I wrote it down. And she said, once we have democracy in Iran, the whole region will be calmer and peaceful. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Certainly, we should not be trying to engage in regime change. I think we learned our lesson that way. Any type of movement towards democracy in Iran would most likely happen from within. The overwhelming majority of Iranians were born after the revolution. They have no memory of the Shah. They only know the draconian, brutal authoritarianism of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and most of the people in Iran don't like it. So we'll see what happens down the line. But at the same time, the regime is very much involved in the Middle East more broadly, and there is the potential of a conflict between the United States and Iran, at least through its proxies. Okay, so what I'd like to do now for the next several minutes is switch to the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict and talk about that a little bit. I'd like to start with some basic points about the conflict that I think are important. And as Ray said in the beginning, this has been sort of a major focus of my study and my scholarship, including my doctoral dissertation at Rutgers University, dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the pre-1948 period. So this is something I've been studying for over 30 years. So this is sort of some of my take on it, but I think it's pretty valid, and I'm not the only one who would say these things. First of all, both Israelis and Palestinians are here to stay. Neither one is going away. Despite what people on either side might like to think, it's not going to happen. And we have to start with that basic understanding. This conflict is not a conflict that goes back to biblical times. It hasn't been going on for thousands of years. This is a struggle between two peoples claiming the same land. It's ultimately a political conflict. It's a clash of two rival nationalisms that, out of pure coincidence, emerged simultaneously at the end of the 19th century. Arab nationalism, the idea that the Arabs living under Ottoman Turkish rule in what was called the Greater Syria region, which is today Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Greater Syria, and also Mesopotamia or Iraq, the Arabs living in those areas wanted to have their own independent country, their own independent nation, separate from and not under the rule of the Turks and the Istanbul-based Ottoman Empire. That was Arab nationalism. It really begins in the late 19th century. Around the same time, Zionism emerges. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Zionism is the idea that the Jews, like the Arabs or like the French or like the Irish, constitute a people, and they should have their own country. But Zionism has a unique thing in that the idea is that the Jewish people should return to where they came from originally. And that, of course, is the Holy Land, the Middle East, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. At the time in the late 19th century, Eretz Yisrael was then in the Palestine region of Ottoman Greater Syria. So here you have the Arabs in the area wanting independence and having their own sense of Arab identity and Arab nationalism. And you have Jewish nationalism with the idea of Jews of Europe wanting to return. But they were not the only Jews, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Britain captures the area that was referred to as Palestine or the Holy Land and other parts of the Arab region of the Middle East as the Ottoman Empire is defeated and collapses at the end of World War I. The British Army marches into Jerusalem in December of 1917, and in 1918, they are in control of the Holy Land. The formal geographic boundaries for Palestine, what we today consider the state of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, those borders that I showed at the beginning of this lecture, they were defined for the very first time, drawn on a map for the very first time by the League of Nations mandate in 1922, known as the British Mandate for Palestine. British Mandate Palestine, the boundaries of British Mandate Palestine are the area that we're talking about today. The post-World War I era and the mandate period, the British Mandate period, which was from the 1920s until 1948, was formative for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Much of what is going on today was established and the groundwork was laid during this period before 1948. The Jewish community in Palestine, led by labor Zionists who were secular socialist Zionists, steadily built a state within a state inside British Mandate Palestine, with the idea that eventually they will actually have a state of their own somewhere in the area, somewhere in British Mandate Palestine. At the same time, the Arab community within British Mandate Palestine was deeply divided along family, regional, and class lines and they really did not have a strong ability to get together as one cohesive community to either resist the building of the Zionist project or to fully resist the British. Although in 1936 they do rise up in a revolt, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That actually is a very important pivotal moment. Continuing with some basic points, both Jews and Arabs are indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. Zionism was founded, as I said, as a political movement of European Jews to return to the land of Israel. However, indigenous non-European Jews had been in Palestine and throughout the broader Middle East and North Africa for centuries, indeed for millennia. And these were Arab Jews and Persian Jews, and then all as in Iran. And then in addition to that, after 1492, when Spain retakes Spain and ends Islamic control over Spain, all of the Muslims and all of the Jews were kicked out of Spain in 1492. And those who were not kicked out faced the Inquisition. But all of the Muslims and Jews who had been living in Spain for centuries basically went to North Africa, and those Jews became known as Sephardic Jews. Sepharad is Hebrew for Spain. So you had what were called Mizrahi Jews, which are the Jews, indigenous Jews of the Arab world, and you had Sephardic Jews, with the Jews that came through Europe and returned back to the Middle East after 1492. You had Persian Jews, the Jews who were indigenous to Persia or Iran. You had the Iraqi Jews who had been there since the Babylonian exile 2,500 years ago. All of these Jews were indigenous, frankly, predating Islam and even predating the Arab conquest, which were the same thing. At the same time, the Arabs of Palestine had been there. I mean, the Arabs have been there since the Arab conquest in the 600s, and before then, other people as well who became Arabized. They were part of Ottoman Greater Syria. They spoke Syrian dialect. The Arabic language has different dialects based on regions. There's an Egyptian dialect. There's what's called Iraqi dialect. There's Syrian dialect, and the people who speak the Syrian dialect are the people who live in what is today Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. Then there's also Arabian, Saudi Arabian dialect, different dialects in different parts of the region. The Arabs of Palestine were indigenous as well, but a unique Palestinian national identity, the idea that the Palestinian Arabs are different than other Arabs in Greater Syria, and they should have a nation of their own or a state of their own, that really develops as more Jews come in, purchasing land, more immigration, more land purchases in the 1920s and 30s. And at the same time, surrounding Arab countries are starting to get their independence. And so all of a sudden, the Arabs living in Palestine don't think of themselves as Syrians, because Syria is moving in a direction of independence. Lebanon has been created out of whole cloth, and it's moving in a direction. Transjordan is moving in a different direction. Egypt, obviously different. And this identity is there's something uniquely Palestinian. They're dealing with the British. They're dealing with the Jewish settlement movement, the Zionist movement of Jewish nationalism as well. All these things play in, and we get the development of a Palestinian identity really beginning in the 1920s and 30s. Both Jewish and Arab rights in Palestine have been established and recognized in international law for over 100 years, beginning with the League of Nations. Israel becomes a sovereign state in 1948 with United Nations recognition. The Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states had rejected the UN's 1947 partition that would have divided British Mandate Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. They rejected it, and to this day, the Palestinians have yet to achieve political sovereignty as a state. Continuing, the broader Arab-Israeli conflict is an interstate conflict between Israel and Arab countries. And really, when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's really more about normalization than it is about conflict today. There were major Arab-Israeli wars between, as you can see here. The last war between Israel and Arab states was in 1973, the October Yom Kippur War of 1973. There have been some major non-state war actors. Israel's invasion of Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. It was against the PLO, and the Second Lebanon War against Hezbollah. Peace treaties, the Abraham Accords, which I've mentioned already. The movement towards Saudi-Israeli normalization that ended with the October 7th attack. The October 7th attack, basically, and the war in Gaza that has taken place since then, really is the latest installment of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been really going on since the 1920s. So basically, we're talking 100 years of kinetic fighting, as well as other things, attempts at peace as well. But really, the conflict itself is a little bit more than 100 years old. The question is to what extent, or one question is to what extent might this spill over into a broader regional conflict, not as an Arab-Israeli conflict, because frankly, it's unimaginable that Israel is going to fight other Arab countries, but it might be with Iran and with Iranian proxies like Hezbollah and others, which also could bring in the United States. I'm going to do this very quickly now. I just want to give you some origins in maps. I want to keep an eye on the time here. As I said, the League of Nations created the mandate system. And frankly, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, what was known as Greater Syria and Mesopotamia or Iraq were Arab areas, but the boundaries that we know of today did not exist under Ottoman control. They were created with the League of Nations mandate system. And so basically the country, what we consider today is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, all of the boundaries were drawn by the British and the French and codified into international law with the League of Nations mandate system. That mandate system created out of the former general area of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab area of the empire, it created countries, modern states. The state of Iraq and the boundaries of the state of Iraq were drawn. Syria, Lebanon. Lebanon was going to be part of Syria, but the French split it up. And Jordan, which originally was part of the Palestine Mandate, it was quickly removed, and it became known as Transjordan. It's called Transjordan because it was on the other side of the Jordan River. And in 1951, it becomes the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan after it annexes the West Bank in the 1948 war. So basically, these countries came into existence, these states came into existence with the mandate system through international law. During the Ottoman control, the Ottomans captured Jerusalem in 1517, and they controlled the area until 1918. During this period under Ottoman control, the Zionist movement started establishing a presence. In 1887, the first Jewish neighborhood outside the walls of Jaffa was established in 1887, and the city of Tel Aviv was founded under Ottoman rule in 1909. During this period, before the creation of Israel, around that time, I suggest there were three failed opportunities for a two-state solution. In 1937, what was known as the Peel Partition Plan, I'll show you a map in a second, where Britain offered to divide the British Mandate into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The 1947 United Nations Partition Plan, when Britain told the United Nations in 47 that they were going to close and shut down the mandate in May of 1948, and the UN, you guys come up with a solution, and they did. And then when the war ended in 1949 with the armistice lines, there was an opportunity then to have a two-state solution as well. So in 1937, as I said, there was a major revolt called the Arab Revolt, where Arabs of Palestine rose up against the British. And they actually overcame a lot of their internal differences, and the British were fighting them. And they were also the Jewish community was being attacked. The Jewish community was fighting along with the British against the Arabs of Palestine. And the British basically came in and said, look, this is not a right versus wrong. It's a struggle of right versus right. Both sides have legitimate claims. We offer to divide the land. And they proposed in 1937 a partition in which the purple area, 20% of British Mandate Palestine would become a Jewish state. 80% of British Mandate Palestine would become an Arab state linked to Transjordan as one giant Arab state. And if both sides would accept it, it would happen immediately. The Jewish side accepted it. The Arab side rejected it. The Arab side, the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world said that they did not believe that there should be a Jewish state anywhere, not even on 5% of the land. The only person who was willing to accept it on the Arab side was Abdullah of Transjordan, because he was going to get independence, and all of this would be part of an Arab state. But there could have been an Arab state in 1937 on 80% of Palestine. That was rejected, and that ended. Jump forward 10 years after World War II and the Holocaust. As I said, the British tossed it to the UN. The UN devised a partition in which part of the land would be a Jewish state, part of the land would be an Arab state. Jerusalem would be under United Nations control. The British were going to have Jerusalem under the mandate. Neither the 1937 nor the 47 plan would have given Jerusalem to either of these new states. It would have been international. But anyway, the Jewish side accepted it immediately. The Arab side rejected it, and war broke out in 1947. When the war ends, two things happen. The state of Israel comes into existence, and about 3/4 of the Palestinian Arab population become refugees. They were either driven out or fled. All wars create refugees, but the Israelis also pushed out refugees as well, and they brought in their own refugees afterwards. The war ends, though. When the war ends in 1949, the West Bank and East Jerusalem are captured by Jordan. The Gaza Strip is captured by Egypt. Had the Arab states willed it, you could have had an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with East Jerusalem as its capital from 1949 until this day. But nobody talked about that. None of the Arabs, the Palestinians wanted the rest of what was now Israel. There was no serious move to say, hey, let's fulfill the UN resolution and declare these lands under Arab control to be part of a new Arab state. That did not happen. These are three failed opportunities for a two-state solution, basically by 1949. When the war ends in 1948, obviously, as I said, about 750,000 of the 1 million Arabs of Palestine became refugees. Most of them went to the West Bank, to Gaza, and to neighboring Arab states. Around the same time, actually most of the indigenous Jews of the Middle East were kicked out of their countries, and the vast majority went to Israel. So you had about 650 to 800,000 Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. Most of them went to Israel between 1948 and the early 1960s. And so you had this sort of a population exchange. Today, about half of the Jewish population of Israel traces its roots to indigenous Middle Eastern Jews. And about the other half traces their roots to Jews from Europe. And there's a tremendous amount of intermarriage, of course. So that's kind of where we are today. 1967, jumping forward here, the Six-Day War. When the war ends, Israel captures the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. Israel captures the Gaza Strip from Egypt. And for the first time, Israel is in control of 100% of what was British Mandate Palestine. And that's pretty much where we are today, with the exception of the Oslo Accords and some PA control over the West Bank. And I'm going to talk about Gaza in detail in a minute. And as you all know, Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for peace in 1979. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is move on to the final main section of my presentation. And that is the October 7th attack and the war in Gaza. The October 7th attack, Hamas calls it Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Al-Aqsa meaning the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The idea being that this attack was basically to be a stage in the ultimate elimination of Israel and the so-called liberation of Jerusalem, and turning Jerusalem and all of Israel into a Palestinian state. And that's why the name Operation Al-Aqsa Flood is that meaning. Israel has retaliated, and we have a very, very bloody war going on right now, which I will talk about now. In order to sort of get this, let's do a timeline on Gaza real quick. So as I said already, in 1949, Egypt captured the area that becomes known as the Gaza Strip. The term Gaza Strip did not exist before 1949. Gaza City, the city of Gaza had always been there. The city of Gaza is centuries old. But the Gaza Strip happens to be the land where the war ended in 1949 and Egypt was in control of it. And that's where we get the term Gaza Strip, okay? Egypt maintained military occupation of the Gaza Strip from 1949 to 1967. There was no attempt by the Egyptians to turn the Gaza Strip into a Palestinian state, either on its own or with the West Bank under Jordanian control. In 1967, Israel captures the Gaza Strip. Now, when Israel captures these territories, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, they don't just capture the land, they capture the people too. And here you have Palestinians who've been living there already, plus refugees who had fled in 1948. So the Gaza Strip was filled with refugees from the 48 war. In other words, Palestinians who had been living in other parts of British Mandate Palestine that became the state of Israel. And so now you have the Israelis are militarily occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and also controlling a couple million Palestinians, obviously against their will. They don't want to be under Israeli control. Israel begins after the Six-Day War in 1967. They build Jewish settlements, a small number of Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. After the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords, as part of the peace accords between Israel and the PLO, in 1994, Yasser Arafat arrives in the Gaza Strip. I was actually in Israel at that time when Arafat arrived. It was quite an interesting time. And he said, for the first time, he set foot on Palestinian soil since the 1950s. Or actually since 1948, really. And he moves into Gaza as part of the Oslo Accords. It was known as Gaza and Jericho First. Some of you may remember that. The Oslo agreements and the peace process was adamantly opposed by Hamas. It was also adamantly opposed by Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the time was the leader of the Israeli opposition, and obviously today he's prime minister. Hamas has always opposed the Oslo Accords, has always opposed a two-state solution, as has Netanyahu. Netanyahu has always been against a two-state solution from the very beginning of the Oslo Accords. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip, and they also pulled out all the Jewish settlers. Many of them were pulled out at gunpoint by Israeli soldiers. A lot of the Jewish settlers did not want to leave. They resisted, and they were forcibly removed. Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. At that moment, Hamas quadrupled its rocket fire into Israel. Hamas took over. In 2006, which is the last time there were legislative elections in the Palestinian territories, Hamas won the elections in Gaza for the legislature. The Palestinian Authority created by Oslo and Fatah, the PLO, won in the West Bank. Hamas then attacked Fatah in the Gaza Strip. There was a mini civil war in which members of Hamas and members of Fatah were shooting at each other. Hamas wins. They drove Fatah out of the Gaza Strip and they took over. In 2007, this is by 2007. So in 2007, Hamas takes over full control of Gaza. They increase rocket fire into Israel. And it was at that point, after Hamas takes over and turns Gaza Strip into a launching pad, that Israel, along with Egypt, imposed a very, very heavy blockade on Gaza. This is when it happens. From 2007 until today, Hamas has built an extensive tunnel network under Gaza. It has fired rockets at Israel from within Palestinian civilian areas. And there have been several mini wars between Israel and Hamas in 2008, in 2014, in 2021. The 2021 mini war ended with a ceasefire that was negotiated by Egypt. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, it was under that ceasefire. They violated the ceasefire when they launched their attack. So what is Hamas? Let me go through this real quickly. Hamas is the Arabic acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It was founded in 1987 during the First Intifada. It's the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the Islamist jihadist alternative to the secular PLO that was led by Yasser Arafat. The Hamas charter declares that every inch of Palestine, meaning Israel as well, every inch of Palestine will become an Islamic state. Israel has no right to exist, and Israel must be destroyed. It launched suicide bombings for the first time during the Oslo peace process with the goal of shutting the peace process down. That's when they first started using suicide bombings. During the Second Intifada, they used suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks as well. Again, as I said, the violent takeover of Gaza, Hamas rocket attacks. Hamas has very strong collaboration with Hezbollah. It receives funding from Iran, as well as other places as well. October 7th, I cannot overstress this. October 7th has changed the Middle East. October 7th is a local version in many ways of 9/11. I teach a class on terrorism and public policy every semester at the O'Neill School at IU Indianapolis. And I have to say that October 7th is one of the most violent and large-scale terrorist attacks in history anywhere in the world. It also was the deadliest attack on Israel since the 1948 war, and it was the deadliest single day for Jews anywhere in the world since the Holocaust. It was a well-planned and executed surprise attack against Israeli civilians. In one day on October 7th, over 4,000 rockets were fired into Israeli towns, and Hamas infiltrated between 1,500 and 3,000 fighters, Hamas and other organizations, into Israel by land, by sea, and by air. Hamas planned the attack well over a year, possibly for 2 years in advance, and they launched it while under a ceasefire. About 1,200 Israelis and other nationals, almost all of them civilians, were killed in cold blood, shot up close, or burned alive, and over 5,000 were wounded on that one day. I'm not going to go through all the details. You guys know, you can read this. Very, very incredibly brutal up close and personal killing. In addition to the killing, there was systemic rape and sexual violence used as a weapon of war. I did the math. Demographically, 1,200 Israelis is the equivalent of about 50,000 Americans killed in one day. In other words, October 7th for Israel was 9/11 times 16 on an American scale. Hamas, as we all know, kidnapped over 240 people, almost all of them civilians, ranging from 80-year-olds to a 9-month-old baby, and they took them back to Gaza and held them as hostages. Hamas filmed their acts with GoPro cameras and posted a video on social media. You can see and hear them killing and maiming truly with glee. The timing of the attack, as I said, was no coincidence. Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to normalization. Both Hamas and Iran opposed this. They've been planning the raid for a very, very long time, but I'm sure that some of it had to do with the timing of the possibility of normalization. Obviously, there were other opportunities that were seized as well. Okay, keep going here. So Israel responds, and it immediately faces a dilemma. How do you fight an existential enemy that embeds itself and attacks from within and from underneath its own civilian population? That's what Hamas does. It's always done that, but now especially. Hamas knew when they attacked Israel as brutally as they did, they knew that Israel was going to invade and going to go back into Gaza. They understood that, and I would think they actually wanted it to happen. At the same time, Israel has to deal with this dilemma, but Israel, as a sovereign state, as a member of the United Nations, as a signatory of international treaties, is obliged to follow international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict, which calls for discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, proportionality in the use of force, and military necessity in targeting. All three of those are essential elements of the law of armed conflict, and Israel is expected to adhere to that. At the same time, they are fighting a force that violates all of these things and uses its own people as human shields. It's a very serious dilemma. To what extent Israel has done a good job is something we can certainly talk about, and I'm going to give you my own thoughts on that. As we know, Hamas has a war-fighting tunnel network over 300 miles that runs underneath cities, underneath homes, underneath schools, underneath mosques, underneath hospitals. Hamas diverts power, water, and medicine from civilians to the tunnels, and they've been doing that for 15 years. And obviously, as we know, many of the hostages have been held in the tunnels. Israel's response was to try to destroy Hamas both militarily and politically in Gaza. It cut off food, water, and electricity that was being sent from Israel into Gaza, affecting the civilian population. And also, their only limited relief supplies have been able to get in. It used extensive airstrikes with heavy ordnance, large bombs, some of which are unguided, what we call dumb bombs, and artillery fire aimed at targets where Hamas people are. But because Hamas embeds itself in civilian community, entire neighborhoods are taken out. Sometimes hospitals are hit. And also, a lot of the heavy ordnance is used because they want to destroy the buildings to get to the tunnels underneath. But if people are in those buildings, they're getting injured or killed. Israel launched its first ground invasion in 10 years into Gaza. The first time combat troops went into Gaza in 10 years, and fighting in a heavy urban and underground combat. It encouraged Gaza residents to go from the north to the south to clear the areas for fighting. But as the civilians went south, so did Hamas. And now Israel might be on the verge of attacking Rafah, which is at the Egyptian border. There are 1 million Palestinians in Rafah now, over 1 million, that are basically there seeking shelter. This could be a massive disaster if that happens. The United States is very strongly trying to get Israel not to attack Rafah. The bottom line, what's been happening over the last several months is a humanitarian catastrophe. Approximately 30,000 Palestinians, most of them civilians, about half of them under the age of 18, have been killed. Thousands more have been wounded. At least 1 million, a little bit more than 1 million or so Palestinian civilians are internally displaced within the Gaza Strip. There's been massive infrastructural destruction. There are major food and aid shortages. It is an absolute catastrophe that's happening. Thousands of Hamas fighters have been killed. We don't know how many. Frankly, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, when they say 30,000 dead, they do not tell you how many of them are Hamas fighters. Any Palestinian is counted as a civilian by them. The Israelis say at least maybe 3,000 or 4,000, maybe more Hamas fighters have been killed. Several hundred Israeli soldiers have been killed or wounded as well. There are still about 100 or more hostages that are still being held by Hamas and other groups inside Gaza. So this is where we are. My last slide is basically looking at what are some of the positions the United States has been taking since this war began, since October 7th and the war. The U.S., as before, the U.S. is providing military aid in terms of equipment and ordnance, and also diplomatic support, including at the United Nations, including vetoing some resolutions, to support Israel's operations against Hamas since October 7th. The U.S. military, as I mentioned earlier, has a presence and has added deployments in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean and elsewhere to deter Iran and its proxies, especially Hezbollah and the Houthis, from expanding the conflict. The U.S. has launched defensive and also retaliatory actions against Iranian proxies in the Red Sea, in Iraq and in Syria. where the attacks came from. The Biden administration is increasingly calling, and they've been doing it consistently, but they're making it even more so. And this is publicly, so I imagine privately it's even stronger, calling for restraint from the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, in its actions that target civilians or that hit civilians. And they're making very strong case that Israel needs to follow international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict. One thing that's interesting is I heard even some Democrats who are strong supporters of Israel in Congress are now suggesting that maybe some conditions should be placed on future military aid to Israel. The United States and a few other countries recently suspended funding of the UN agency in Palestine, the United Nations Relief Agency that deals with Palestinian refugees since 1948. They've suspended funding because several members of UNRWA actually joined Hamas in the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. And so in response to that, funding has been cut. That raises all sorts of issues. Obviously, the funding helps the Palestinian people, but at the same time, you had UN workers actually engaging in terrorist actions. The United States has been engaged in extensive negotiations and shuttle diplomacy. Foreign Secretary of State Blinken has made multiple trips to the region. We're engaged in diplomacy with Qatar, Egypt, and others, trying to set up humanitarian pauses, hostage and prisoner exchanges. About half the hostages have been released through exchanges in which the United States played a major role in getting those negotiations to be successful. We're trying to do more of that as well. Now the focus for the U.S. is on a longer-term ceasefire to allow much more humanitarian aid and to get all of the remaining hostages released, the ones that are alive anyway. It's I believe that maybe 20 to 30, maybe 40 or 50 hostages that were taken by Hamas are dead now. We're not sure for sure. And then my final question, or final point, is the war in Gaza, which is very controversial. I'm sure we'll talk about it in the Q&A, is creating a potential political fallout for President Biden and the 2024 elections. We saw the uncommitted vote in Michigan, I believe, on Tuesday, and about 100,000 people voted uncommitted, symbolically showing their displeasure with the Biden administration, and Arab Americans and also a lot of young Democrats very upset with what's going on. These are all things that are, domestic politics absolutely impacts foreign policy. It always has, and it always will. These are all things that are very interesting that we can talk about. I actually made it on time. I even, believe it or not, I spoke fast, but I ended a little bit sooner than I thought I would. So thank you.
Okay.
And let's do questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Pierre. If you have a question, send it to the chat room and I'll kind of monitor those and call on people in the order in which they post their name. If you can ask your question, we'll call on you to ask your question. Maybe to get started a little bit, why do you think that the reaction to the public over the killings in Gaza have been so different than what happened in Syria, when actually many more people were killed in Syria?
That's a really good question. There are several different answers to that, I think. One is Israel is an American ally, and it's American, American equipment and American funding that is helping Israel do this. I will say also American funding. I didn't mention this at all, but the Iron Dome, which has shot down most of the rockets, most of the thousands of rockets that have been fired, that's also largely funded by the United States. The Israeli casualties will be much larger, probably in the thousands more, had it not had Iron Dome to be able to shoot down all of the Hamas rockets. But first of all, the attention, the level of destruction is very large. But absolutely, the level of destruction in Syria is more than 10 times larger than what's happened in Gaza. However, the United States, frankly, it's people fighting each other that I think most Americans don't have a connection to. When Israel is a combatant, it brings in a lot of emotion on both a pro-Israel and an anti-Israel side that frankly wasn't happening with Syria. I mean, obviously there was Americans taking in some Syrian refugees and things like that. There was a sense of concern and caring, I think, for what was happening in Syria and what is still going on today that doesn't get reported. But yeah, I mean, and now I don't want to sound too cynical, but I remember Thomas Friedman once said in his book From Beirut to Jerusalem, written in the 1980s when he was covering the Lebanese civil war, and he was asking sort of the same question. He said, Jews or news? He was kind of cynical about it, but he said when Arabs kill Arabs in the West, that's not seen as newsworthy. When Jews kill Arabs or when Arabs kill Jews, that becomes newsworthy. And I don't want to say that I necessarily agree with that completely, or that's the only answer, but that's part of it as well. I mean, who cares about what's going on? Why do people care about certain things? I will also say the Yemen civil war, which has been going on since 2012, over 350,000 people have died in the Yemeni civil war, in which Saudi Arabia is on one side, Iran is on the other. A lot of them have been killed by bombing. A lot of it have died by starvation and famine and disease. But over 350,000 have been killed and died. Over 500,000 have been killed in the Syrian civil war, probably closer to 600,000 now. The United States got involved because of ISIS, but otherwise, no. So your question is a great question. It's a very important one. I've partially answered it, but it's something I think we all have maybe a different sense for why that gets so much more coverage, even though it's 1/10 the size of the death toll. A lot of it is just where the media coverage is, you know.
All right. Betty Townsend has a question, and then Rebecca Keating, I'll call on you after Betty. Go ahead, Betty.
Do. Thank you, Rick. Pierre, in one of your slides, it was mentioned that Trump does not support a two-state solution. And I think it's fairly well established that should he be elected, then he would be have such close ties with Netanyahu. With the concern with the uncommitted vote that occurred in Michigan of 100,000, which is substantial. And Michigan is a critical state to be won in the November election. Is it understood that Trump is not going to, if a vote for him by the Arab American community is not going to be a vote in support of the kind of support they want to see from Biden, who I think in his own way is trying to get there. Do you see an understanding of this, and that there'll be a return to support for Biden in November by the Arab American community throughout the U.S., but aside from just Michigan, understanding that Trump is not going to deliver good news for the American Arab community?
So great question, and there's a couple of different answers to that. First of all, I think not everybody not all of the 100,000 people who voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary in Michigan would not vote for Biden in the November election. Okay, I think a lot of people actually, and even some of the exit polling suggested this, that they actually were doing it as a symbolic protest vote, knowing it's the primary, to send a signal to Biden, hoping that in the next few months we'll see change in policy or something like that. I agree with you. First of all, Trump, one of the first things he did when he became president was he imposed a Muslim ban. He actually even called for a registry of Muslims in the United States, and other kinds
of. He will again.
So you have that, and definitely if the choice is between Biden and Trump, for an Arab American, a Muslim American, a Palestinian American, no matter what, Biden would be better. Biden supports the two-state solution. Trump, with Pompeo, they changed the policy, and they basically gave a total green light to settlement expansion for Netanyahu, when every previous president had said, no, you can't do that. Pompeo said, do whatever you want, and basically undermine the two-state solution. And the entire Abraham Accords, by the way, which were done with the Trump administration, was really the driving force behind the Abraham Accords was the fear of Iran. But the whole idea was, and this turned out to be a fallacy, was that Israel can make peace with Arab states and ignore the Palestinian issue. Okay, and there were countries willing to make peace or make normalized relations with Israel because of the fear of Iran, because of their own interests and all that kind of stuff. And frankly, leaders in Arab countries don't really care that much about Palestinians. They care about their own interests. Their people care about the Palestinians, and all of these leaders are non-democratic. There are no democratically elected leaders in the Arab world, possible exception of Lebanon and sort of Iraq. But basically, the ones that were normalizing with Israel, these are non-democratic leaders. All that set aside, what I will say, the concern for Biden and the Biden team in November is not these people voting, either Arab Americans or not. Arab Americans are predominantly concentrated in Michigan. okay, for the large part. Obviously, Hillary Clinton lost Michigan in 2016 by 10,000 votes. Biden won Michigan, I think, by about 300,000 votes. Okay, so it's not just about Michigan; it's also about younger voters. There is a generational difference in attitudes about Israel and attitudes about the Gaza war and all sorts of things, about justice issues, things like that. The main concern for the Biden administration is not young people and Arab Americans voting for Trump. It's them not voting, not showing up at the polls. If enough people in Michigan who are disillusioned about Biden don't vote, Trump could win Michigan. I don't think now some Arab Americans might actually say they're so mad or they're going to vote for Trump or whatever, but I think the real problem is get out the vote and them not voting. And that's a real concern. And it isn't just about Arab American voters, it's about young voters. And the youth vote made a very big difference for Biden in 2020. Without the youth vote, Biden might not have won. And if those people don't vote, or if they stay home and they're not enthusiastic, that could be a major factor. I think Biden is going to win the popular vote, no problem, in November, but he very much likely could lose the electoral college vote, and Trump could become president again. And I think that's a very plausible scenario.
All right, thank you. Rebecca Keating, you're up next. And Mel,
It's actually Steve Leffler. I
Oh.
just wanted to thank everybody. It's been very informative. I appreciate everybody's time. I do not have a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Mel Miller, yep.
Yes, I just find it curious, the news media coverage of this war. What is the distinction between when they talk about Israeli hostages? It's always hostages. When they make a swap, it's Palestine prisoners. Is there really that big of a distinction?
Yeah, I mean, most of the prisoners have actually been arrested and charged with crimes. They were not. They were serving. They were in jail, and a lot of them are for attacks or for other types of things. Some of them are less violent. Some of them are more violent, and so they are. I mean, these are now. There's also some that were detainees that were detained and maybe hadn't been charged yet, but they were not. They were not civilians going about their lives doing absolutely nothing, that were then taken from their homes, with maybe their family members killed or raped, and then they were taken. And also, we're talking about young children. We're talking about 80-year-old people. The youngest that the Hamas took was a 9-month-old baby. The youngest American was a 3-year-old. And so they went into civilian areas. One of the goals was to actually kidnap as many people as possible and take them back. So, and what they want was an exchange of hostages for prisoners. That's nothing new. There was at one point, about 10 years ago or so, Hamas crossed over from a tunnel into Israel and kidnapped an Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit. And Israel exchanged, and it's a very controversial thing, Israel exchanged over 1,000 prisoners in exchange for this one Israeli soldier that had been taken. One of the prisoners who is exchanged was actually the guy who planned the October 7th attack, and who had been convicted of murder, and to the great regret of Israel. And one of the and by the way, so the exchange that took place so far was at a ratio of 3-to-1, 3 Palestinian prisoners for every 1 hostage. What Hamas is demanding now is a 10-to-1 ratio. They want 10 prisoners for every hostage. And so this is sort of the dynamic. And also they're also holding dead bodies, and they'll trade dead bodies for Palestinian prisoners as well. So I think it's an important distinction. The people that were captured were people at a concert, people living in their homes, survivors of the violence. They were not prisoners. They were kidnapped and held as hostages for ransom.
No, I understand that. I just thought on the other side, when we talk about them being prisoners, are they prisoners due to the war, prior conflict with Israel? Or are they, you're suggesting they're all prisoners from other criminal activities other than the war?
Well, I mean, when you say the war, I mean, there's the conflict, but I mean, some of the people are prisoners because they attacked Israelis. They stabbed Israelis, they shot at them, they physically attacked them. They might have been prisoners because they were involved with, smuggling weapons to Hamas or other organizations. That's generally what they got. They were arrested and very often charged and convicted of certain crimes. Okay, and they were in jails, and they were released from jail in exchange for the hostages.
Okay, thank you. Larry Chimino has a question.
Thanks, Ray. Can you hear me tonight?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. Pierre, this is great. I appreciate your coming on again. It's always really educational. I wanted to back up to something a little more general. I was thinking when you were talking about the struggle for power between Shiites and Sunnis and so forth, I was thinking in terms of Islamic nationalism or Shiite nationalism versus Sunni nationalism, and how that relates to what Hamas is trying to do in areas, or Hezbollah. And I'm thinking about whether this is a cautionary tale, since we had a session recently about Christian nationalism in the United States. Is this what the Christian nationalists are looking for, where they dominate every form of society, putting their own people on top in social situations, in government, in education, and what they call the seven mountains, if you would, which means that everyone else that's not their brand of Islamic religion in the Middle East or Christianity in the West is somehow a second-class citizen. And I'm not sure where we're going in the United States, but it scares me when people want to roll everything under Christian nationalism here. And should we look to Iran and the people that they're supporting as what that might look like if a minority decides that they deserve to take over, and that everyone that's not in their camp is lesser in the society than they are and doesn't deserve to be a leader? So I'm trying to formulate my thoughts about that. Do you have thoughts about that? And do we see this? Should we see this as a cautionary tale of what might happen in America?
I have thoughts. I think given the topic we're talking about, it's probably not the best. I don't know if I want to share my thoughts on that. But I think also that there's a problem in going too far with analogies, because it's revolutionary Islam in Iran has very different kinds of roots than Christian nationalism in the United States, and there's a lot more going on there. There's also kind of regional power struggles and things like that frankly, there were tensions between the Shah of Iran and Saudi Arabia beforehand, and so there's sort of like the countries themselves, the geopolitics plays a role beyond just sort of a theological differences and things like that. I think it's, I don't want to take the analogy too far. I would totally agree with you. I personally do believe that I do believe Christian nationalism in the United States is definitely a danger. I think it's a threat to the Constitution and our constitutional republic. And frankly, a lot of people who do that have attitudes that I think would undermine the Constitution. And I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you. Eric, you got a question?
Yes, I do. Excellent presentation, very even-handed, and I very much appreciate it. One thing, if I remember this correctly, in the 1947 map, and I may be misremembering this, but I thought the Israelis were promised 20% of the land, and the Palestinians 80%, or something.
That was a 37, the Peel Partition Plan.
Okay, the Peel.
1937. Yeah.
Oh, okay, but wasn't there something in 47?
Yes. Here, hang on. Keep talking. I'll share my screen real quick.
In other words, between 47 and 48, and my understanding from what you said was that Israel accepted this, and it was, the Palestinians rejected it. And then what I guess my question is, which would have, um, which would have advantaged the Palestinians much more than 1 year later in 49. What happened in that period of time to cause that big a difference?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that the Jews had always been in the region, okay, but they were a religious minority, and the indigenous Jews of the Palestine area, the indigenous Jews of North Africa, the indigenous Jews in Iraq and in Persia or Iran did not have nationalist aspirations. They did not want to have a Jewish state. They were either well treated or not well treated, but basically they were living under Islamic rule or under the rule of whatever country they were living in, and that was it. Zionism as Jewish nationalism was the idea that the Jewish people constitute a nation and the nation should have their own state, just like Arab nationalism or Irish nationalism or Italian nationalism, the unification of Italy, things like that. All right. And it was exactly that kind of concept was sort of a 19th century European idea that also influenced the Arabs. So when Zionism comes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Jews that are coming in from Europe have ideas of, we're not just Jews, we're not just returning to the Holy Land, we're not just returning to the land of the Bible and all this kind of stuff in Jerusalem. We actually want to go ahead and build. We're buying land. We want to do everything ourselves. We don't want to hire Arab labor. We're paying for the land. We're buying it from Arab landowners and things like that. But we want to build our own place. From the very, very beginning, the Arabs of Palestine and the Arabs around Palestine and other parts of the Arab world did not recognize the legitimacy of Zionism, did not recognize the legitimacy of Jewish nationalism, that the Jews constituted a nation and should have their own state. They saw Jews as a religious minority living under Islam, just like Christians were a religious minority living under Islam in Islamic countries. And so they totally rejected the idea of that. From the very beginning, as soon as Britain comes in with the mandate, and part of the mandate is they're supposed to encourage Jewish settlement, and at the same time respect the rights of the Arabs in Palestine. That was part of the League of Nations mandate. From the very beginning, they try and set up joint institutions for Arabs and Jews. From day one, the Arabs of Palestine refused to cooperate in any way with the Jewish side because they did not believe in the legitimacy. They said, you're a religion, you're welcome to be here as a religion, but you do not have, your nationalist aspirations are not legitimate. Our national aspirations are, yours are not. So from the very beginning, they were unwilling to accept any idea that any part of British Mandate Palestine should become a Jewish state. And therefore, there was an utter 100% rejection of the 1937 Peel Partition Plan by the Arabs in Palestine. And there was a rejection of the 1947 Partition Plan where the Arab side got less, frankly, with the UN partition. And to this day, there are rejectionists. Over time, a lot of Palestinians and a lot of people in the Arab world have come to accept, whether they believe in the legitimacy of Zionism or not, they have come to accept the fact that Israel exists. And therefore, Israel exists and we have to deal with it. Now, how do we actually deal with them? And we recognize Israel, but we need a Palestinian state. There are other people to this day, including people in Hamas, who fully do not recognize the legitimacy of Zionism in any way. They don't recognize the legitimacy of Jews. Frankly, Hamas doesn't recognize even the legitimacy of Jews in Palestine at all, even as a non-state. And so that's why they rejected everything, okay? And the rejection ultimately led to each time when an offer was put on the table, it became less. When you get to the end of the war in 1949, that's where the war ends. And those are what we call the pre-1967 borders, that third map I have here, okay? At that point, the Arabs of Palestine who became refugees, who were living in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, were not saying, hey, let's recognize the United Nations resolution of 1947, and let's at least establish a Palestinian state on the land that we're living in. They did not, nobody said that. And the Arab states who took the land, Egypt was now controlling the Gaza Strip. Jordan had annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem to Jordan. They said, hell no, we're not giving it up. Okay. The only way they got rid of it or got no longer controlled it was when Israel defeated them in 1967. So that's basically it. So that it is sort of like the saying no, being a rejectionist was sort of a fatal mistake. Today, I would say that there are rejectionists we find rejectionists on both sides. Netanyahu is a rejectionist as well, and does not want a two-state solution. I would argue that this is a political conflict. This is not going to be resolved militarily, not the 100-year-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think Hamas needs to be degraded, definitely. But there's not going to be there's going to be a political solution, and it has to be some type of a partition of an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. But we're not there right now. That's a long answer to your question, but I think to understand why was the rejection taking place, it was because they never recognized the legitimacy of Zionism as Jewish nationalism. And that argument moves forward today with the rejection of the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And a lot of people to this day believe that of all the 192 countries of the United Nations, the only country that has no right to exist is the state of Israel. Other countries were created by partition, Pakistan and India, for example, Jordan, others. But those are legit, but Israel is not from this perspective. And I think that's where you sort of get this sense. Sorry, I kind of went off on a soapbox, but that was a long answer.
All right, well, thank you. Umi has a question.
Hello, Umi, one of my students.
Hello, Professor Atlas.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
So my question is, do the circumstances today make a two-state solution more difficult compared to when the conflict first started?
Yeah, I think right now it's several things have made it very much more difficult. First of all, the conflict right now, the animosity, the bloodshed, it's hard for, I think, a lot of people to on either side to get their heads around a two-state solution. One of the other problems is that over time, the land that would become part of a state of Palestine has become smaller because of the increasing number of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Gaza Strip, Israel pulled all their settlers out in 2005. There are no Jewish settlers in Gaza. But in the West Bank, there's almost 500,000 Jewish settlers now in the West Bank. And they've taken up a amount of land. Now, as I showed in my class the other day, when you look at the pre-1967 border, at its narrowest point, Israel without the West Bank is only 9 miles wide. Okay, that's less than from Monument Circle to Carmel, right? So most of the settlements are sort of thickening the boundary. Okay, but a lot of settlers are deep inside the West Bank. If there were to be a two-state solution, I believe that a lot of those settlements would have to be removed. And that would be very controversial in Israel. It might actually lead to a civil war among Israelis. The settlers in the Gaza Strip were literally pulled out by soldiers kicking and screaming. But the West Bank is what a lot of Israelis call Judea and Samaria. The West Bank is the Holy Land, the biblical land of Israel. The holy sites of Israel, of ancient Israel, are mostly in the West Bank. And so there's a lot of emotion there. On the other hand, for a viable Palestinian state, a lot of those settlements, especially not near the 1967 border, but they're deeper in the West Bank, they would either have to be removed, or there would have to be a willingness to accept the Jews still living there, but they become citizens of the state of Palestine, and they'd have to follow Palestine law. And that's hard to imagine right now. There are other options. I mean, the thing is, the lines separating the West Bank, that line just happens to be where the war ended in 1949. There's nothing sacrosanct about that line separating Israel from the West Bank. Theoretically, you could redraw the internal lines of what was British Mandate Palestine, and you could shift things around. But that's a very imaginative thing. The bottom line to the question is, if there is a will, there is a way. If there is a willingness of people on both sides to say, how can we actually get to a point where we have a viable Jewish state, Israel, and a viable Palestinian state living side by side? If there's a willingness to do that, then you can have all sorts of imaginative solutions about redrawing maps or sharing things, even sharing Jerusalem as a capital for both states, things like that. Right now, there is no will. And frankly, the will has been degraded even more. It might be another generation before you get to a serious two-state solution. I think what you can hope for at the best right now is not conflict resolution, but conflict management. Getting to the point where you stop the shooting, you start to rebuild Gaza, all this kind of stuff. What's going to happen is there going to be some type of self-rule, maybe not sovereignty. On the other hand, the other thing, frankly, what may happen is it could very well be that the international community might just de facto declare the creation of a state of Palestine. And UN, I mean, it's not that simple, but and then deal with the actual territory later. But start giving Palestinians full sovereignty politically in the international arena. That may happen, and then deal with what, disposition of the land later. But it's getting harder and harder to get to a two-state solution. At the same time, I believe that's still the only way to resolve this conflict, because Israelis are not willing to live in one state where they're a minority, and they will be from the river to the sea in that sense. Palestinians want their own state. Both sides want their own state. Very few people want to have a one state where they're the minority or they don't have equal rights with the other side. So that's part of the problem. Sorry, another long answer to a good question.
I guess that kind of
Very
also
much.
like relates to how there's been 3 failed like attempts to that whole situation. So I
Yeah.
kind of get it, yeah.
And there were other, look, there were offers, I only ended in 1949. I mean, there was an offer in 2000. There was a plan in 2008 or so. And the thing is that one of the, I once presented a paper at a Middle East conference years ago where I made an argument that whenever we've seen peace achieved in the Arab-Israeli arena, there was always some synchronicity between the Arab leadership, the Israeli leadership, and the American leadership. Whether it was Camp David with Egypt, whether it was the disengagement agreements after the 1973 war, Oslo, the Jordanian peace treaty, Egyptian peace treaty, you had an American president, an Arab leader, and an Israeli leader all on the same page, being willing to do it. When you lack that synchronicity, it falls apart. There were some times when both the Israeli and the Palestinian leaders in the mid 2000s were possibly ready to do something, but President Bush wasn't that interested. But usually it's been an Israeli offering to do something and a Palestinian leader rejecting it, or the other way around. And so we have to get that kind of synchronicity, and that's another real problem. Leaders matter, and if you don't have good leaders, you're not going to get a lot done.
All right, great. We have time for one more question. Arlie, are you out there?
Hi, yes, thank you so much. This was a really great talk. I just had a question, and maybe it's naive, but throughout history, when armies conquer land, it becomes theirs. How come the settlements are considered illegal when a war was waged against Israel and they did not want that war? They won the war, they managed to conquer that land. Why is it now illegal for them to build on that land?
That's a great question, and frankly, the answer is the rules changed in 1945. After World War II, the international norms, international law, basically changed, and the idea of acquiring land through war is no longer acceptable. Whereas in all of previous history, that's how countries expanded, right? So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and annexed Kuwait, not acceptable. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not acceptable. They're getting away with it because they're powerful. But in terms of is it acceptable? No, it's not. And so that was the idea. I will say when Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza and the Sinai in 1967, the Israeli government at the time actually immediately wanted to start negotiating with the Arab states to exchange land for peace. They captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai from Egypt. They wanted to start talking about that. That was in June of 67. In August of 67, at the Arab League summit in Khartoum, the Arab League voted unanimously what became known as the 3 no's of Khartoum. No negotiation with Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiation, no peace, and no recognition of the state of Israel. Okay, and that basically shut down everything. For the hardliners in Israel who did not want to give up any of the land they just captured, it was a blessing, because they said, we have nobody to talk to. The entire Arab world has basically said, we will not negotiate with you, we will not make peace with you, and we will not recognize your right to exist. And so it was a victory for hardliners who wanted to keep the land, and that basically shut down the possibility of any kind of serious peace for many, many years. And then, of course, you get the Egyptian peace treaty. This is not a class in Middle East politics. I'm not going to go through how that happened, but basically, it was a land for peace. And Egypt left the Arab League to make peace with Israel, and Sadat paid the price by being assassinated for doing it. Okay, and so things have changed since then. But basically, the rules and international norms of what happens when you acquire territory through war really changed with the end of World War II, and that's really what happened. Because clearly, I mean, look at the United States. I mean, we started a war with Mexico It was a war of territorial aggression in 1846 for the purpose of taking basically 1/3 of what is today the United States. And you know, that was considered completely legitimate in 1846. After 1945, that's not considered legitimate anymore by the international community. So that's kind of the answer.
All right, well, thank you. We're out of time here. Really appreciate your great presentation tonight, Pierre. And I'll turn it back to Betty to say goodnight.
Thank you. Great questions, by the way.
Thank
All really good questions.
You know, Pierre, I think you could go on for another half an hour. I think that you are such a draw. You really are. If somebody knows that you're going to speak, then they know they're going to get a program that is full of this much data and information. And in fact, I was thinking that my students at Purdue in the global studies class I'm doing have to read and write something every week. And I'm actually thinking of totally scratching the assignment they have for this week and sending them the link. Ray, when will we get this recording up, you think? When do you think we'll get the recording up? You're muted.
By the weekend, I hope.
Okay. Well, that's good. I've had some people who could not log in tonight with other conflicts, but they were asking me if it was going to be recorded. And
yeah, it would be good. Let's shoot for Saturday if we can, because I really would like to send them this link, have them listen to this, and then have them write, draw some question out of that, because this was just incredibly important and so informative. And I know typically when you do come and speak to us, you do focus on this area of the world. It's an area of your expertise. And sadly, well, the area never stops giving us enough fresh material, it seems, every year.
Yeah, it never gets boring.
No, I mean, you have to put together a new slideshow every year for us, because it's just always something new that's going on in a part of the world that's ancient. And that's really the cradle of the Abrahamic religions, the cradle of civilization close to it in Africa, and in an area where the hostilities go back, as you say, centuries. So these are not new hostilities. This is not new nationalism. And yet there's something just new every year. And it impacts, well, maybe it's not impacting Ukraine, I don't know, but it just has the reverberations are gone. I think everyone enjoyed this evening. I want to thank you very much for doing this. It was great.
Thank you.
Once again, please do not forget, by the way, Pierre would probably like us to also point out, this is your 20th year presenting with the Great Decisions.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think either 2004 or 2005 was my first one. I've done it every single year on different topics, obviously. So, but I really enjoy it. Yeah.
Well, when I first got involved with this, when I first got involved with this on the board, I think it was Claire who said, well, we need to do something with, she was part of the Great Decisions Committee at the time. I think we need to bring Pierre in. And of course, that's when John Clark was still alive too. And John Clark used to be a regular, and he would always have really great programs. And that's when we were still in person. Please do not forget, next week, just sign up. It will be on Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. Science Across Borders. This is going to be another sensitive subject. It seems every year we seem to talk about China in some capacity. This is not focused on China, but China will no doubt be one of the focuses of the conversation. And that is the shared research from collaborative labs that came out that allowed us to come up with a vaccine so quickly for COVID. But a lot of that shared research was with China. So the focus next week, it'll be a good program. Please join us. And the focus is there trust? We're sharing something very sensitive. Is there trust? And then understanding Indonesia the following week, 11:30 program, 11:30 on a Wednesday. So we're very keen to find out, how do you all respond to a midday program? And that will tell us a lot. Then, of course, we have the rest of the year. We have NATO the following week. I'm going to probably also have my students listen to the NATO program, or as a recording or to come. And then we will end the year with pandemic preparedness. Some of you may have seen in the news, that this is a retired Surgeon General under Trump. He's now at Purdue University. He's going to be doing this program for us. Apparently, he had an experience in an emergency room recently, and there was a $5,000 charge or something, and he was pretty upset about it. And he was beginning to wonder if our healthcare system is broken. And I thought, only $5,000? You know, of course, surely he's got insurance, and so this is not something I'm sure he's paid out of pocket. But I thought, only $5,000? That sounds pretty low to me. Anyway, we will see you next week. Thank you once again to Pierre, and thank you for joining us. You're a great audience.